Well, good morning. This morning we're going to learn chapter 21, which is the chapter on what is called the imperfect indicative. The imperfect tense is the tense that is used to describe a continuous action, normally in the past time. Whereas in the present you can have it either be continuous or undefined, in the imperfect it is always a continuous action that is being described. Greek has another past tense used to describe undefined actions. So the imperfect is always continuous, normally in the past time. The imperfect is formed from four basic parts. It starts with what is called an augment, and then the present tense stem, then a connecting vowel, and then secondary personal endings. So there's two new things in there that you haven't seen before, the augment and the secondary personal endings. So for example, let's take the present tense stem lu, and the augment in its case is the epsilon. So you have epsilon and then lu, and then a connecting vowel, and then a secondary personal ending, in this case nu, and you get eluon, which means I was loosing or I was destroying. Now, if you want to make that middle passive, then you just use middle passive secondary personal endings. And so, for example, you have eluamein, just a different set of endings. Okay, let me say something about what an augment is. An augment is basically a prefix that is stuck onto the beginning of the verb to indicate that it's a secondary tense, that it's in past time in this case. There's a couple of different ways to form an augment. If the present tense stem begins with a consonant, then the augment is an epsilon. So you have the present tense stem lu, starts with a consonant, so you augment it with an epsilon, and you get eluon. However, if the present tense stem begins with a vowel, the augment lengthens that initial vowel. So the present tense stem agapa goes to agapon. See what happened there? The alpha lengthened to an eta. Now I know you're used to alphas lengthening to alphas, but when it comes to augments, alphas lengthen to etas, just like epsilons. So agapon is an imperfect. The eta is the lengthened initial stem vowel, and that's what serves as an augment. What about the root erota? The present tense stem begins with a vowel, so the augment is lengthening the vowel. Epsilon's lengthened to eta, and you get a rotone. Okay, what about a compound word? What about a word like katabino? If you realize that the augment is indicating past time, that it's a secondary tense, then it wouldn't make any sense to augment the prepositional part of the compound verb, would it? Now, it only makes sense to augment the verbal part of a compound verb. So if you have a compound verb, it's not the preposition that gets augmented, but it's the second part that gets augmented. So katabino goes to katebainon. Now, there's a couple other things going on there. What usually happens is if the preposition that is used to form the compound verb ends in a vowel, usually that vowel is dropped and you have a regular augment. In this case, the epsilon before the beta. Now, sometimes what happens if the final vowel of the preposition is an iota, especially if it's peri, then the iota stays there and you still have a regular epsilon as an augment. But the important part to see is that it's the verbal part of the compound that's augmented. If the preposition ends in a vowel, normally that preposition drops its final vowel. And if it keeps its final vowel, that final vowel generally does not contract with the augment. And finally, one more situation. You have the root heurisk. In the imperfect, it's heuriskan. In other words, it is very common for initial diphthongs to show no change when they're augmented. Now, sometimes on epsilon, upsilon, the epsilon may go to an eta, but generally initial diphthongs stay the way they are. they don't show the augment. You remember in the master personal ending chart, there are 4 quadrants to this chart. We know the top left and the bottom left. Okay, those are the primary active and the primary middle passive. In this chapter, we're going to learn the other 2 parts of the master personal ending chart. In the upper right, we find the endings that are secondary active. And so, for example, the paradigm eluo is eluon, elus, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon. And the true endings are nu, sigma, nothing, men, te, nu. Now you notice a couple of things about those endings. The first singular and the third plural are the same. And surprisingly, that doesn't get that confusing when you read it in context. Usually there'll be some kind of indication whether the subject is I or they. So it generally isn't a problem. But notice also the similarities with the primary active endings. Second singular, it's got a sigma. First plural is the men. Second plural is a te. So there actually are some pretty good similarities there. But that's the secondary active personal endings and the paradigm for the imperfect active of luo. And as I said, the imperfect indicates always continuous action, normally in the past time. So I was loosing, you were loosing, he, she, it was loosing, and so forth. In the lower right quadrant of the master personal ending chart are the secondary middle passive endings. And the endings are main, sa, ta, mitha, stha, nta. Then you stick them on the augmented luo and you get eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamatha, eluestha, eluanta. Again, the second person singular has got that sigma that drops out and you have contractions. And there are some similarities and yet some differences with the active as well. Okay, so there you have it. The master personal ending chart is now complete. Every tense that you're going to learn from here on out is either going to use these endings or some slight variation. So it's just critical, you all, that you commit this chart to perfect and absolute memory. And the upper left-hand corner is primary active, and those are the endings we use with the present active and the future active. And then in the lower left-hand corner, we have the primary middle passive endings. And those are the endings we use in the present middle passive and the future middle. In the upper right-hand corner, we have the secondary active endings. And we use those in the imperfect active. And then the lower right-hand corner, we have the secondary middle passive. And that's used for the imperfect middle and passive. And finally, we have 2 more lines on the master verb chart. Now, are you all keeping up with your master verb chart memorization? All right, yeah, it's just 1 to 2 lines a chapter. But if you procrastinate and put it off, all of a sudden there's going to be 5 or 6. So make sure you keep up with your memory work. The imperfect active is formed with an augment, the present tense stem with the connecting vowel, and the secondary active personal endings. And so, for example, we have eluon. And then in the imperfect middle passive, and again, like the present, the middle and passive are identical in form in the imperfect. We have an augment and a present tense stem, connecting vowels, and then secondary middle passive endings. And so, for example, you have eluamen. Okay? So that's the imperfect, continuous action normally in the past time. Good job.